All right, folks, it seems like a few people are still trickling in, but we are going to get started. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this morning, and welcome to Patient Access API, a Q&A with industry leaders. I am Kurt from Arcweb, and today I'll be moderating a panel and Q&A from three experts in the areas of patient data access as we explore the implementation, ramifications, and impacts of the US Patient Access API and other recent data regulations from the CMS and ONC. We'll get to our panel in just a minute, but before we do, I wanted to mention that this is the third webinar in our healthcare data series, with previous entries providing an overview of the Patient Access API, as well as an exploration of some of the ramifications for innovation. You can find those videos on our YouTube channel or on our website at arcwebtech.com. They're a great resource for anyone who is interested in exploring this data, this aspect of patient data, and they do a really good job of covering the basics, as well as some of the innovation opportunities are going to be in the coming years. After our panel, we'll be doing a live Q&A with the panelists. So if you have any questions during the panel, feel free to drop them into either into the chat or into the Q&A panel, and we will take those questions when we get to the end. Now, without further ado, let's move on to our panelists. If each of you could please introduce yourself and maybe tell us a little bit about your background. And we'll start with Kristen, and then Deven, and then Chris.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kristen Valdes, founder and CEO of b.well Connected Health. We are a digital transformation platform, and we work with employers, payers, health systems, and retail pharmacies to reimagine the consumer experience in healthcare, helping to bring the outside data in, so allowing consumers access to all of their health records to have in one place, but then leveraging that data to create hyper-personalized communications to help people proactively get upstream and manage the healthcare of themselves and their families. And ultimately then provide easier access to care through things like mobile appointment scheduling and finding a match from a doctor perspective or care perspective, whether it's in person, virtual, or digital. So really happy to be here with you all today.
Hi, everybody. I'm Deven McGraw. I am the lead for data stewardship and data sharing at Invitae, which is a clinical genetic testing company. But before I came to Invitae, I was a co-founder and the chief regulatory officer at Ciitizen, which is a platform that helps patients gather all their health records from all the places where they've been seen. And we focused initially on cancer patients, in part because our founder had really formed the company because he'd lost his sister to metastatic breast cancer, and they really struggled to be able to gather all her information together in order for her to get additional opinions about her care and to find out whether she was eligible for clinical trials. We continue to work with cancer patients, but also with rare patients with rare neurological conditions. Most of them are children, and we're expanding hopefully exponentially from there. But obviously the Patient Access API is a topic that's near and dear to my heart, Kristen's heart as well. So I'm super excited to be here too. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Cera. I'm the CEO of Arcweb Technologies. We work with growth leaders to build custom digital products. We're located in Old City, Philadelphia. We're 10 years old. We're a certified B Corporation. Just this past year, our healthcare work has been recognized or honored by 5 different awards, including yesterday, our work on the Care and UX Guide, along with some of the folks on this call, received a World Changing Ideas honoree yesterday. So I'm excited about this program. Grateful to Deven and Kristen for joining us. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much, everyone. So for our first question, I wanted to start with kind of framing where we are right now. It's been over a year since the patient access rule first really went into effect. So to set the stage, I'd like to ask each of you what you think the impact has been so far on your corner of the industry, whether directly from the Patient Access API requirement itself or from other related requirements like the information blocking rule. Has there been meaningful change? And let's start with Deven.
Yeah, I think things have definitely changed. There are, from a patient access rule perspective, there are a number of health plans that, well, they didn't really have much of a choice, but they jumped into it, pulled things together relatively quickly, and and access for patients to the claims and clinical data that payers that are regulated by that rule has improved. It's not without its hiccups, and it's a little bit frustrating actually that a year in, it's still not, as smooth of a glide path as we would like. I would say on the provider side, in terms of the interoperability rule, I think we see maybe a lot more friction. Kristen may disagree with me that there does seem to be, it's not this sort of seamless process that I think we all envisioned would happen initially. I think we're getting through it. I think we'll come out of the other end of this with the kind of experience that patients deserve. Not quite there yet, but has it improved? Yeah, given where we were before, which was patients didn't really have a way to access much at all, if anything. We are definitely in a better place.
Yeah, I will absolutely agree with Deven. I think that first of all, any new type of regulation then needs to be operationalized. So I always like to tell people you can come up with and think through every use case as possible, that you could come up with for a regulation that needs to be rolled out to the health, to the industry just at large. But at the point where you have to operationalize it is when you realize all of the flaws that were missed. And so we're at that kind of early bumpy part, which is the early adopters are recognizing where did the regulations not go far enough? Where did, we need to create best practices for operationalizing? How can we make things a little bit smoother to get to that ideal experience that Deven was referring to? But in my world, for sure, there has been a sea change. We're no longer having to, defend whether these rules will go live or whether people will comply with them. I definitely think, payers had an advantage by going after providers and learning from some of the things that did not go well on the provider side. So in my mind, it is definitely a lot easier, but still not without flaws. And I'll just give a quick example. One of the biggest challenges, it's almost like if a tree falls in the wood and no one's there to hear it, did it really fall? Well, if people put out public facing APIs to third-party applications and no one knows where they're located, do they really exist? So there are challenges still with even just discovery of how many organizations have APIs available. And it's actually a mismatch on both sides. We're obviously looking for endpoints for consumers, and and providers and payers are looking for third-party applications that can actually consume this kind of data. And so, we can't test and operationalize in, everyone. We're just one of the more, I would say, well-known companies in the space, but we need to have more innovation and more companies out using these API endpoints and creating more use cases and proof points so that the industry will continue to lean in and not feel like they spend a whole lot of money on new technology infrastructure that's not being leveraged at the pace at which they would like to see it.
Generally, I think it's a win. It's happening, and the processes are currently stabilizing. I think specifically the caregiver access and sort of the bona fide channel for caregivers is a huge win. Arcweb has been doing a lot of educational meetings and content like this, and so we've talked to a lot of very early stage companies and large companies that are trying to bring solutions to market. And I feel like we've seen fairly low adoption on the B2B side, at least if I consider looking back a couple years ago and thinking that there'd be hundreds of apps potentially very quickly, or at least I was one of the fools that believed that. I believe that there's been only double-digit numbers and small numbers of them that are actually have API keys and are hitting the payers directly. So I think there's been some reluctance by regulatory folks at a lot of companies to be the first mover on anything, let alone something this complex that goes between multiple government agencies and different rulings. We've spoken with a lot of people at the pharma companies, medical devices, digital therapeutics companies. These are companies that are very comfortable with different regulatory environments, with the FDA and the FTC and other consumer agencies. And I think it's going to take them years to get comfortable with just how complex the data side of this is, but I do think they will eventually get there. And startups, I think, have there's still just a fair amount of friction, but I do think that the startups are going to be the ones that ultimately get acquired by the big companies, and that is when the big companies will be quote unquote doing it, is I think when they buy some of the smaller companies that are doing it. There's still a good amount of complexity of integrating with lots of different health plans. There's lots of FHIR endpoints. I also think it's been a challenge for companies, just the holes in the market. So if you focus on government control plans, great. But if you're trying to tap the entire market or the employer side, there's still a long way to go. Props to Humana, for going above and beyond and actually making their employer plans compatible with the patient access API. I think that advocacy effort among many is really important, and it is really an advocacy effort at this point to get the employer plans to agree to provide this data, and it costs them time and money and resources, so it's not free. So I think it's a big decision for them if they want to endeavor, and hopefully that's where the industry moves. So again, props to Humana. And another just side effect, and I guess maybe I haven't been professionally paying attention as long as some other folks, but I just want to really give props to a lot of the patient advocates. I think they really matter. There's been significant storytelling and promoting their causes in meetings with the Care Alliance and on social media to convince the industry to change. And I think that's been one of the motivating factors here.
Yeah, and I'll actually add one thing to what you just said, Chris, that I think is important. In our experience, the payers and the providers who had to comply with these rules and regulations have been so focused on complying with the regulation. What we're seeing is that there is starting to be a bit of a sea change in their thinking around, wait, how do these rules and regulations start to help me and my business? I don't think that there was a lot of time for being strategic about how the data accessibility to patients could actually start to leverage improvements in their own businesses, goals and objectives. And especially as you think about folks that are taking risk, we've got payviders everywhere now, right? Payers and providers, and those lines are really starting to merge. But if you're, at risk and you're trying to, reach out to people in this time of great staffing shortages, it's really important to be able to automate as much as you can. So if consumers can gather and collect their data outside of a company's own silo of, or view into that human, if they can see the whole human, then that's where, data science really comes in and adds a lot of value. And not even just data science, but sometimes just basic algorithms like, hey, you're due for a colonoscopy and you don't have one. I'm at risk for making sure you get one, but I could proactively communicate and say, hey, based on your medical record that you shared with me, you haven't had your colorectal cancer screening. Here's education. And by the way, do you want to make an appointment, or would you like me to send you, an FDA approved toilet water test to your home? So being able to automate those things without our most coveted resources, our doctors and nurses having to pick up the phone, which can be very expensive and time consuming. I think now is the time that that both providers and payers are recognizing that the data and the consent to share that data can actually be beneficial to their business and the objectives of keeping people healthier longer. And so I think the hundreds of apps that we wanted to see show up, kind of right after making this accessible, I think what's going to happen is they're going to definitely start to service, the healthcare delivery system in a much better way once people have taken the time to think strategically about how the data can be beneficial to their own goals, not just to the patient themselves.
Yeah.
So Kristen, you kind of started moving into this question already, but one of the goals of these new rules and subsequent efforts of organizations like the Care Alliance was to give patients more direct control over their healthcare data. I'd like I'm going to throw back to you actually, because this is probably most directly relevant to some of your efforts. How far do you think these changes have advanced that goal? And are there steps that other players like third-party developers can take to push it even further?
For sure. We have to recognize that FHIR is still a pretty immature standard, when we talk about the fact that we are still modifying, the processes for the base data sets that are actually out and in use and in the market today. And they do cover the overwhelming majority of the data you would need to close an open gap in care, which is what drives the monetization of Medicare Advantage plans, direct contracting entities, and the ACO REACH program, but also most ACO contracts in general. So there's enough there to really get started on gathering the data, but it's really important that a consumer, and I cannot stress this enough, you can give consumers access to their data and control. But it's really important to create a social contract with that consumer where if you're asking them to consent to share their data, it needs to add value in their life. There has to be a trade-off, right? So if you're coming to me and say, hey, Kristen, will you share your medical information with me? And it's the health system that I go to for 100% of my care. And I then know that, if I'm on vacation and have to drop into, a hospital for some reason, that information can be shared back into, the doctors who care for me for follow-up and other things, then there's a reason that I'm sharing that information with you. Or if you're going to personalize, helping me with things like, price shopping and affording my family's medications, then it's a value creator. So I think it's not, we spend a lot of time talking about data, and I think we need to change the conversation to talk more about value. And because everything should be done with consumer consent, because the one thing we can't have third-party applications coming out and doing is eroding trust in the industry and in the market at a time where we're just getting started. And I know, Deven, you've had a lot of opinions on that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Kristen, you've said so many times, patients don't live to get their data and have control over it, in terms of like, it's not, nobody wants to be monitoring their data all day. The data is in service of something else, right? Some other need that you have. And it's one of the reasons why, we really started with very sick patients, because they actually do have a need for their data right away. Have a need often, again, for second opinions, or if they have a very serious illness, they often are very committed to making sure that data can also be leveraged for research, to find better treatments, to find cures, even if not in time to help them, to help other people like them. It's a high motivation factor. But it is really about putting that, absolutely, the data has to be under their control, but not just for the purpose of putting the data under their control. It really is about giving them an experience, improving their ability to manage their illness, or manage that, or have family members help them manage an illness, or to give a parent a way to manage an illness of a child. So, and again, hopefully you won't need to look at your data a lot at all. You're a fortunate person that isn't sick, but when you need it, you want it to be there at that time and not have to go and spend the time to gather it. I do think, we don't have sort of baseline privacy rules that protect, apps that sit outside of HIPAA, and that, has been a lingering concern. It continues to be something that motivates a lot of pushback still among entities who are sort of subject to these rules and haven't yet bought into the value proposition that Kristen mentioned about this is actually a win-win all the way around. And, the concerns about data going into apps and not sort of fully appreciating where it goes from there is a legitimate one. We worked with Arcweb to help address that in terms of a sort of front end to help people make better choices. It's the reason why we joined the Karen Alliance and created a code of conduct. I do think that once these API pipelines of data are more solidified, I think we will see more apps sort of cropping up and claiming to be apps that are working on behalf of the patient, but are really just conduits for data to primarily be for another purpose, where the patient is asked for their authorization to send that data along, but isn't really provided with a record that they can also use and access and share. And that's going to be a real challenge, I think. I think it's something that we can deal with. I think the policymakers are poised to act on this. I'm talking in particular about some HIPAA proposed rules that we're trying to sort of clarify what makes an app a personal health app and which doesn't. But ultimately, we just probably will need Congress to act and create kind of a floor below which nobody can fall. Because I couldn't agree with Kristen more. When you have bad actors in this space, it really can set us back pretty significantly in terms of the work that those of us that are in this for the right reason are trying to do.
I don't have a lot to add that wasn't addressed by Kristen and Deven. Just want to really say props to the Karen Alliance for getting over 70 companies to come together, reps from most major health plans, and creating a platform for discussion, creating a code of conduct, tying in the FTC regulations from data that was previously at covered entities, and helping with the patient and member education requirements. And another, just thinking about the platform of the Karen Alliance, the FTC in the middle of last year, the FTC I felt like was starting to rattle its sword around the health breach notification rule, and Karen Alliance, had a very quick meeting and discussion about it, and I felt like really up to speed on what was going on. So I just really want to say props to them for advancing a lot of the goals of this cause.
So shifting a bit more into kind of the applied ramifications of the rule. Throughout the webinar series, we've talked about the opportunities in different industries to work with some of this data. I'd like to ask each of you if there are any particular applications you've seen that are especially novel, or if there are any particular ones you're looking forward to or excited about in the future.
Well, I know we are developing a clinical trial matching tool that we're pretty excited about. We actually have matched a number of our cancer patients to active clinical trials, gotten them in, helped them apply for and get into these trials. And, for at least one patient that we know of who is doing extraordinarily well, and she has a very rare cancer for which there is no standard of care treatment. It just shows us like what the possibilities are when you put actionable data in the hands of patients and allow them to, consent to having it be populated in tools that can actually give them some advice, give them something that they can use, give them something that they can take to their treating physicians and say, hey, how about this? Another example is molecular tumor boards for cancer patients. If you have a type of cancer that is where there is a characteristic of the tumor where you would be a better match for a certain type of precision medicine therapy, to be able to say, hey, here's a marketplace essentially with a bunch of services that I might be able to leverage, and that I can consent to allowing these tools to access my data in order to give me something that can be helpful to me. So those are just two examples that we've been looking at on our end. Again, being in cancer, there's sort of a kind of sight line around a set of tools that can be really helpful to people in navigating their care journey.
Yeah, I would say, the application of having the data allows you to really create personalized communications to people that are relevant to them. Healthcare has largely been pretty one size fits all, right? Everyone needs to get their flu shot. Everybody needs to, sleep more. Everybody needs to walk more, be gluten-free or soy-free or dairy-free, or whatever free we think that everyone should be at the moment in time, right? But the reality is that it's, even one of the top medical, academic medical institutions in the country who's been treating my child who has, an autoimmune condition every year, mom shames me for not getting her a flu vaccine. And they're the physicians who tell me she can never have one. So it's very generic and quite frankly, introduces a lot of risk and error. And I think with being able to have access to the data, we can get more granular and personalized around all kinds of things. And if you look at the, kind of regulatory underpinnings of where value-based care is going and where it's been trying to go for a very long time, it's really all about alignment to evidence-based medicine and best practices, because we have research and science that shows if you can align people to evidence-based medicine and practices, that they will live longer, healthier lives, they can avoid preventable chronic conditions, and they can control conditions that they already have. So, where Deven is really focused in cancer, we're actually focused more broadly into the population as a whole. And so whether it's population health, value-based care, risk-based models, it doesn't really matter what it is. Everybody needs a colorectal cancer screening at a certain age. Everyone needs to have, mammographies regularly. They need to see a doctor. They need to have their labs drawn. If you're someone living with diabetes, you need to have your A1Cs measured, every 6 months. And we need to know if you're in control or out of control with your diabetes. That's your risk for hospitalization. But we also fail to educate consumers on healthcare, just in general. I truly believe it needs to be a course taught in school at some point growing up, right? How to pick insurance, where most consumers don't know that your medications could cost something different if you went to a different pharmacy. Yet when we go into the doctor's office, they're like, what's your favorite pharmacy? Well, the one that's going to save me $100 is my favorite pharmacy. Can you tell me which one that is, right? No, we don't do that, right? So when we have access to the data, we can tie in great programs like a GoodRx that can actually price shop your family's medications and provide more of an easy button that says, hey, did you know your family could save $100 this month by switching from, CVS to Costco? And next month, we could do the same. With APIs, we could actually start to then make that easy button to say, do you want me to transfer your scripts? And there's plenty of services out there that can do that, and or open APIs that can do that as well. What we know is what consumers want is less complexity in healthcare. They also want to proactively know when there is something that either they or their family needs to do to maintain their health standard. But today we don't get those like happy birthday calls or emails from our doctors saying, hey, I was just looking over your family's medical record and here's the things I'd like you to do next, because we don't build time incentives for things like that to happen, or payment incentives. So these applications now with the data have the ability to say, it's time for your child to have their tetanus shot. It's been, 9.5 years. Let's get them scheduled in the next 6 months. No one on the street can tell you the date of their last tetanus shot unless it was like in the last month. No one knows, right? So by having access to this information, you can actually proactively get upstream, which the industry has been talking about for many decades now, by letting people know in a personalized manner when there's something that they need to do to align to evidence-based best practices. And so I'm excited about just, quite frankly, doing the basics that we don't do today and making it easier for consumers to have experiences in health versus having to constantly research, pick up the phone, go to another portal, go to another website and figure it out themselves.
Well said. As far as novel application happening right now, I really like what One Record is doing and how they're essentially lighting up one payer at a time and making a lot of noise. And I feel like it was apps like this, which are what a lot of people envisioned would be out there. So it's really nice to see that happening. We mentioned the colonoscopy example. I think there's a lot of medication adherence examples for primary and secondary adherence. I think apps like MediSafe and others will have a whole new host of functionality that doesn't rely on data entry and whatnot to actually put your medications in and whatnot. So I think that's going to be a very big deal. I mentioned earlier, haven't really seen much with relation to pharma companies, medical devices, or digital therapeutics, but I think that's to come. Some of the educational sessions that we've done have actually been attended by providers, and we've gotten a lot of interesting questions from providers. And I think we might see certain spaces like home health or telehealth that are actually using patient access APIs to get data for a number of reasons. Another thing that I've talked to some entrepreneurs about, and I don't know anyone that's done it yet, but just being able to negotiate with payers to get a business associate agreement, and something along the lines of don't make me get this information from the patient access API. You really want to establish a business associate agreement with me, and I think that there's ways that this API can be leveraged to advance other kind of business transactions.
Well, so but Chris, that does bring up my point, right? Like we didn't create these patient access APIs to shove all data through it for any potential purpose under the sun. It was intended for patients to be able to get control of their data and have the ability to then go and share it as they see fit. So it's a little bit of a cautionary tale. If the provider, if the APIs on the, that require business associate arrangements are challenging for people, then let's fix those challenges. And not decide that the patient is now going to be the superhighway for data for all sorts of purposes, because all I need to do is just get them to check a box that they've authorized it without sort of fully appreciating what they've done.
Well said, Deven. I'll bring you to.
So a big part of the impetus for this rule and for kind of the overall push of opening up some of the healthcare data and making it easier for consumers to direct the flow of it was to open up new opportunities for third-party innovation. I'd like to ask you all what advice or recommendations you have for entrepreneurs and other third parties who are looking now to jump in and begin making use of these regulatory changes and start incorporating some of this data into their products. I'll start with Chris for this one.
I think companies should strongly consider it. It certainly requires some strategic planning around it. And Kristen mentioned a lot of this. What better value can you deliver to your patients, caregivers, and your customers over your competitors once you have this data? How will you change the patient, caregiver, or customer experience in your product? What's the budget and the timeline that you need to implement the engineering effort, and is it feasible? And can you create a go-to-market strategy that doesn't require you to boil the ocean? Can you pick specific geography, plans, or customers for your initial minimum viable product? There's a lot more to it than that, but those are the first few that come to mind.
Yeah, I would take a slightly different angle, which is, if you're going to jump into, the deep end on this, the thing you need to really think about is building consumer trust. And making sure that you have transparent information, that you're creating those social contracts. I mean, I'll just use us as an example because I can't speak to any other applications, but, just having them check a box and click through a very lengthy terms of service and privacy policy, where their consent is given without their, full understanding, can create a very, quite frankly, a very bad outcome for your company when it's called out by patient advocates and others when they identify that that's what you're doing. And they will, because through social media and other things, there's a very powerful, kind of voice and channel and network out there. And so, we've seen in the press and in the news, even things that are completely covered around HIPAA in terms of data sharing, that, patient advocates and care partners just aren't appreciative that their data is being shared under business agreements without their knowledge. And so, being able to create in a, fourth grade reading level, I am not going to advertise to you based on your data. I am not going to sell your data. It is yours to control, right? It will only be shared with your consent, and providing transparency to where and how that data is shared, I think is really important, because we need to build trust from a consumer perspective that their most coveted data, it's not like a credit card that you can cancel and get a new one. If your health data is out there, it's still you, it's still your data, that they can trust applications to add value in their lives, but also to keep their information secure. And in alignment with how they want their data to be under their control. And I think it's really important, because one of the first things that b.well has to do with all of our contracts, with all of our customers, when we get a contract, is go to that data ownership section that's been sitting in a legacy, contracting, format for the last many decades, where healthcare stakeholders believe that they have ownership rights over data. And the reality is in this new hybrid world, where consumers can draw their data down outside of HIPAA and it can be under their control, any customer who puts forward interoperability as a, hey, we want to help your family manage and control your medical records, they don't own that data. And so, you really have to be very thoughtful about what your data practices are. And I would say, before you jump in and just start connecting, make sure you spend the time that it's going to take to do that really well. And again, I think, through the work, with Arcweb and Care Alliance, we've provided some front ends. We've provided publicly facing annotated terms of service and privacy policies that really support this new environment. We created, and I would encourage you to look at things like app implementation onboarding guidelines, so that as you're connecting in a market that is not as consistent or standardized as we would like, that you can help educate people towards a standard that will make it easier for you and everyone coming behind you, to implement with payers and providers as you're registering for, the APIs as well. So I would just, and quite frankly, talk to people who've been doing it, who can kind of guide you through the landmines and what to watch for, and help you hopefully do it better, smarter, faster than, kind of some of the pain that early adopters like us had to go through.
Well, that's what I was thinking. I was thinking of a metaphor around what's the water temperature, right? So when we started this work, it was super cold, and don't get, it was really hard slogging to, in the early days of the implementation of these rules, much less pre-implementation, when things were really just at the proposed stage, and we were really fighting very hard to leverage ways for patients to get data. I would say the water has temperature, in terms of whether you're ready to jump in or not, is definitely more, at least lukewarm. Like you can get in, but it's not hot. It's not, there will still be, if you're expecting a smooth experience, if you think that this should be easy, if you think you are not going to have to work hard, that's not this industry. It's not this industry yet. I sort of feel like we don't, I think part of the reason why the Care Alliance works as well as it does is that, at least from the app community, we don't really see ourselves as competitors yet. We're all like, anybody who is able to sledgehammer their way in and get connected, like, it opens a door for everybody else. And we're all just, collectively trying to, work in this work through some of the obstacles. And a lot of times we do this together. At some point when things get really easy and the kludginess that still exists is gone, then we'll compete on the stuff that really matters. But right now it isn't, the water is not that warm. So if you're looking for a super easy experience, this is not the industry for you. But if you have a really good idea about a way to improve healthcare and a way to make things better for patients, then you're likely to be as committed as we are to like slogging through and getting it done. And we would welcome you. Come on in, help us make the water warmer.
That's right. With open arms, we will welcome you.
So, but between the patient access API, the information blocking rule, and a few of the other regulatory shifts, there are obviously a variety of new compliance requirements that have been placed upon the payer industry, upon providers, and upon vendors. What do you all on the panel think of the industry response in terms of achieving that compliance? Are there any additional changes that are still on the horizon, either in terms of how the industry pursues compliance or in terms of additional rulings that people should be prepared for or expecting? Maybe I'll start with Deven this time.
I do think that OCR will finalize its HIPAA rule. Maybe not this year, but at some point, because there do seem to be a lot of questions that come up for covered entities who have to expose these APIs about the intersection of the API rule and the interoperability rule with different HIPAA requirements, and a little bit of head scratching where I think some clarity from the Office for Civil Rights in terms of HIPAA expectations will be welcome, because nobody wants to sort of feel like they're being told by one set of laws that they have to do something, and yet they think they're in conflict with another set of laws. It's a very uncomfortable position, creates uncertainty, which translates into the kludginess that we've talked about, and keeps things from running as smoothly as possible. So I think an OCR HIPAA rule, I do keep hearing rumors that the FTC is writing a privacy regulation that will be very interesting for entities not covered by HIPAA rules, in terms of sort of how is the FTC flexing its muscle beyond their existing breach notification authority. So that's another thing to look at. And I do think, and this is not, I was in government, but I don't, just so people understand, I don't have any special pipelines of, for inside information. My colleagues are very good bureaucrats. They don't tell me stuff they're not supposed to tell me. I do think that the TEFCA, which is the Trusted Exchange Framework and Common Agreement, that is expected to open up some additional sources of data, like from health information exchanges, for example. I think that ONC will act to create some strong incentives for entities to sign up. It's a voluntary network, but if, for example, under information blocking rules, you got a presumption that you were not blocking information if you were connected as a node on the TEFCA network and exchanging data, that you might be able to enjoy some sort of presumption. This is just, I again, not because I have any special information, but the Cures Act told ONC to create this voluntary network, and also gave ONC a tool in the information blocking rules to leverage to incentivize people to join that network. And I think ONC will use it. So I would keep an eye out for that too. Probably not until right before Christmas, but yeah. The Office of No Christmas and regulations to read over the holidays.
I think Devin's spot on. The only thing I would add is I think we should look for clarifying FAQs to continue to come out, because there is still some confusion in the market around a lot of how to operationalize a lot of these things. And so even the regulations that are put out there are still very much questions. There are legal and privacy, security, and compliance lawyers that, I think are still not understanding why and how the rules were created in order to create more flexibility for third-party applications. And so, organizations like ours and One Record and others that are in the space, are being told that we need to sign, business associate agreements in order to access APIs, and so there's still a lot of confusion and friction around the rules that are there. So I feel like we do a lot of education in the market. And, again, I think that that's why, many of us do this, that we work together to create consistent messaging in the market so we can get to a common understanding where the rules were less than specific around the operationalizing of how all of this is done. So I think there will be more FAQs coming out specifically, and then I think there will be additional data sets that today are not made accessible to consumers that are part of their overall health record that still need to be made accessible. And I think that we'll see advancements there. But I think Devin's comments were exactly spot on, on the regulatory side of things.
Yeah, I agree with everything that was said too. I'll just add a few things. I know for the patient access API, most of the major health plans are participating. There's hundreds of plans in the country, so I'm not sure about the smaller plans and the compliance there. So that's an area of interest for me. I really like the ONC Lantern project. This is a new project that ONC put forward. So then you can see API endpoints for a lot of the major health systems, the version of the EHR that they're running, a lot of other information. I would love to see something like that similar on the payer side. As far as on the right, we get asked a lot of questions about accessing data from providers, and I do think that there's some things on the horizon that are noteworthy. At the end of this year, the standardized API for patient population services is supposed to be live for providers, providing essentially a standard interface to pull that data. And then the EHI export, some people call it bulk fire. There's a few names that get kicked around for it at the end of 2023. I think it's going to provide population level data to business associates and make things a lot easier with a lot less API calls and a lot less data getting kicked around. So I'm excited about all those things on the horizon too.
I just wanted to mention one of our attendees, Naveen, shared a great link just now to the panelists in the chat that answers some of what Chris was just mentioning, which is cmscompliancetracker.com. And it looks like it provides some information about whether or not your plan is complying with the patient access API. It looks like a potentially great resource. So thank you for sharing that, Naveen.
Yeah, thank you. I remember seeing an article about that at one point, and I lost track of it. So I'm grateful for that. Thank you. So
this new block of rules and guidelines were drafted and implemented with a great deal of discussion and feedback from the industry. Now that they're in place, kind of wrapping up the panel portion of this discussion, are there any additional steps that you would like to see from regulators, either in response to industry needs or to further the goals of consumer data access? What do you think is coming next, and what do you think should be coming next? And I'll also add, if you have any questions for the Q&A portion as an attendee, please drop them into the Q&A panel or into the chat. We have a couple already, but we can definitely use a couple more.
Yeah, I mean, I would like to see data sets that are missing that I think apply to the overall consumer experience in healthcare. So things like HSA and FSA balances and accounts, where we can really help create, a better healthcare wallet and, information for consumers. When we think about healthcare and people talk about how, broken, our industry is, I think it's working the way that it was designed, but the big problem for consumers is pricing. And we just need to be clear on that. Like, healthcare is too expensive and unaffordable and inaccessible in a lot of ways. But if we can start to open up data sets that help people at the point of care or at the point of sale understand that maybe there are better incentives, or benefits that maybe they don't understand or how to use, help them understand how to maximize, their ability to pay for healthcare, and how to select the appropriate plans, from a coverage perspective for their family, their needs, their medications, their, clinical conditions. So I'd love to see new and different data sets continue to emerge for consumers that they otherwise wouldn't have access to, that will spur even additional innovation in the market. And I'm hoping that we can continue to see that trend.
Yeah, I think more to piggyback on something Kristen said earlier, more guidance coming out from the regulators, both from ONC and CMS, to kind of clarify some of the gray areas and questions that have arisen is always very helpful. Again, uncertainty creates obstacles, creates sluggishness, and the more clarity that can be provided, the better. And then ultimately, we're going to need some enforcement. I think at some point, these rules are requiring people to make some pretty significant changes in how they've been operating. And while we certainly see some stellar examples of people who jumped in, Humana was mentioned earlier. There are some on the provider side too, who, really, believe that this is the right thing to do. They actually see the advantages as opposed to just checking the compliance boxes. But there are far too many who are still very resistant, digging in their heels, or doing what death by 1,000 cuts, right? Like, I think I'm in compliance, but I'm just going to do this one other thing that makes it slightly more difficult. That's not standard. That I can justify the reasons why I'm doing it, and it's usually about privacy and security. And yet that's what I'm going to do, and it creates a different experience in connecting to that one facility, as opposed to here's the playbook. Here's how industry is generally doing this. And that creates, again, this sort of kludginess and sluggishness and obstacles on the part of apps that are trying to, again, leverage these rules in order to create an experience for their customers, which in our case is patients.
My top choices were clarity and enforcement, which have both already been talked about. And as far as like a want or a wish list, would really like to see the patient access APIs become available for all of the health plans, including employer plans. As that's very difficult in our current market. These are private companies, and enforcement is complex. But I do think it's something that is really needed. On the provider side, I would like to see a similar API mechanism and system like we have for payers, for providers, where third-party access for health IT developers with a standardized interface is created. So many companies come to us, we need to penetrate the market as quickly as possible. We try to have a good bedside manner when we explain to them, because they're crushing their hopes and dreams about how hard it actually is to do it. With these APIs and just how hard it is to partner with some of these EHR companies, since there's almost no incentive for them to partner with an early stage company. And some of them, the only reason they do is because they're just fearing regulators, but it's a very complex game that they're playing. And it's just been hard to penetrate. So that's some of my wish list items.
And I'll just open up to one that's really broad, and I don't know it's within anybody's control, but I think the war to be won is APIs for access. So you see early adopters and leaders like CVS, who's now partnering with Google, so you can mobile schedule and hold your place in line at a Minute Clinic, right? Or make your appointment digitally. Consumers are very, very specific about the fact that, they do not want to have to keep picking up the phone, to make an appointment. And oftentimes when they're looking for a new doctor, it's like, oh, we're not accepting new patients at this time, or other things. So I think the whole way that we're talking about data, but I think access is the war to be won, because when you have the data and you can make recommendations and you can, help align people to evidence-based guidelines, you then need to help them connect to the actual care that they need and at the right level of care. And until we can start to see, and I'm hoping that it will be market pressure that will create these open APIs, where people, I'm hoping that, like health systems, as an example, will have to open up their APIs publicly facing in order to book appointments with their physicians, and specialists or others, or get on a waiting list for cancellation and make more consumer friendly items. And I think the pressure is going to come from the new entrants that are out there that understand consumer, like the CVSs and, the Walgreens and others, the Amazons, who already know how to make those things easier. But access is often the most frictionful part of healthcare. So I'd like to see us go beyond just data conversations and into access. That's my biggest wish list item.
Thank you so much, everyone on the panel. We're going to transition into the Q&A portion. We only have a couple minutes, but we should be able to cover hopefully at least one or two questions. First one, if TEFCA is mandatorily enforced by new regulation or gains traffic or attraction organically, is the patient access work oriented around username and password of the cures rule ultimately a waste?
I wouldn't call it a waste. I think, I think ultimately we, there's a lot of work being done to make sure that the volume of data that can be accessed through these APIs is as complete as possible in terms of sort of matching the HIPAA designated records that the patients have the right to. But it will be there will be some limitations because ultimately the electronic medical record vendors are not the possessors of all of the, they don't necessarily have access to all of the data. Images is a key example. Pathology reports are in another system as well. So routing everything through those pipes could be challenging, also sort of puts us in the position of always being dependent on certified electronic medical record vendors and their compliance with rules or willingness as private companies to be the pipelines for all of this. We're kind of trying to turn them into data utilities, and I'm not sure how well that's going to work. So I think we have to leverage all the sources of data that are out there today, and Kristen mentioned a couple more. And I think TEFCA allows us to do that. In terms of TEFCA being mandatory, I think the most that regulators could do would be to create incentives to participate in it, as opposed to requiring people to participate in it, given the language of the 21st Century Cures Act. So I think it's more of we'll have different pathways for getting different types of data. But the easier you can leverage through a single connection, all of that, the better off we'll be, as opposed to sort of deciding that there's sort of one pathway versus another, if that makes any sense.
I think it's also important to note, and I talk about this a lot, I've coined kind of a new diagnosis code that I like to refer to as portalitis. The way that we have designed and implemented, FHIR APIs is that we're still tethering people to a portal, right? So from a business perspective, you can have a health system and a provider say, wait a minute, now I have to maintain in parity at my own cost. My website has to match my digital solution, which we know consumers are looking for and liking. And I also then have to maintain parity with my portal. But when you think about people who have multiple kinds of doctors and specialists and others, and it is estimated that a consumer's health data is stored in no less than 75 different locations, right? In my daughter's case, with an autoimmune condition, she has 17 patient portals. None of them are accurate. None of them talk to each other. They are not interoperable with one another. So why are we tethering people to portals when we can use digital identity standards to give consumers or give customers, excuse me, healthcare stakeholders the confidence that the person behind this, mobile device is who they say they are? Why should they have to then create a portal account where oftentimes when they don't have one and don't want one, they're told they have to have an in-person visit in order to get one, right? There's a lot more, FAQs that need to be pushed out around how you gain access to data. But the reality is that with a certified digital, credential, that we can get away from portalitis. We can go to HIEs and HINs and pull more data down if there's participation without having to have a portal account. And it also allows freedom and flexibility for health systems and providers to not have to maintain a portal when the world has moved to digital. And so I think that there's a lot of opportunity, but I think that we've got to make it, we have to create a lot less friction. And if you go through the process and where the friction points exist, right now it's in having to have a portal. And let's not forget that every time one of those systems has maintenance or is updated, the tokens break. So if you're a third-party application where you're trying to provide value to the consumer and they're saying, yes, please, b.well, go grab all of my data and tell me when my medications are cheaper, tell me when care is due for my child or my parent who doesn't live with me. If we're constantly pinging them to log back in to their portal, they're not getting the value, but we can't stream the data to provide the value that we want to give to them. And so I think we have to try to, again, stop making court systems do more than what they were designed to do. And we need to take the regulations a bit further to provide, more security, more privacy, more trust, but in a way that doesn't require consumers more friction. And so I think portalitis is a diagnosis code we can eradicate in our lifetimes. And, I'm here for it. So I'd love to see that happen.
I think we have time for one more question. We have a couple complicated ones. I'm sorry that probably don't have time to get a good answer for, but here's one that I think is somewhat straightforward, or at least more straightforward. How can app developers get patients comfortable with sharing their personal data?
Have good policies that are clear for people. It's the trust issue that Kristen mentioned earlier. Like, patients are willing to share their data, but they have to trust that you've given them that control, and that the experience that you're offering for them to share is something worth doing in their view. So there's some vetting, I think, that goes into putting something in front of somebody.
All right. Well, thank you everyone so much for attending. Thanks to our panelists for sharing their expertise. Everyone who attended will be receiving an email tomorrow that will include the recording of today's webinar. If you have additional questions, we'll also include some contact info. So please feel free to reach out. I know that Chris and I are typically very accessible. And I'll also just mention that we've been part of the Karen Alliance for a couple of years, and just being a part of that community has been itself something of an education in this area. So if it's something that is important to your organization or relevant to your personal interests, I would definitely encourage you to get involved. It's a great way to really get up to speed on everything that is going on right now in patient data. Lastly, if you're coming out of this meeting fired up for your own organization to jump into product development for something that takes advantage of this data, we have a new webinar series starting next month that will be digging into all the processes and best practices of taking a new digital product to market, from initial strategy and partner sourcing through to the nitty gritty of product road mapping and launch. So keep an eye out for that around the middle of June. Thanks again, everyone, for your time and expertise, and thanks for joining us today, and have a great rest of your day. Cheers.
Thanks,
Hi,
everyone.
everybody.